This is the Retro Hour podcast with me, Dan Wood, and it is time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And I'm so excited to talk to our guest this week. Someone who I've watched on YouTube for a good few years now. Massive fan of his YouTube channel, Dave's Garage or Dave's Garage, depending on which side of the pond you're from. And he's got an incredible career in the industry as well. Particularly, I'm very excited to hear about his time at Microsoft as well, where he worked on technologies that millions of people still use every day, stuff like the Windows Task Manager, ZipFolders, and a game that I spent way too much time on as a teenager, 3D Space Cadet Pinball. So we'll hear all about that with our special guest this week, Dave Plummer. How you doing, Dave?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really appreciate you taking the time to do some reminiscing with us over the next hour or so. Now, one question that we always like to ask our guests, just to get a bit of background on kind of where it all started for you. I mean, do you remember your earliest computer experience, what initially got you into computers?
I do. I wandered into a Radio Shack store when I was about 10 or 12, and they had the boxes of a TRS-80 Model 1 Level 1 had just arrived from Tandy or whoever shipped it to them, and they hadn't set it up yet. And I saw it said computer. I was like, oh, can I play with it? Can I set it up? And they were like, they didn't think I had a shot, but they're like, yeah, go ahead, kid. And it's really no harder than hooking up a stereo, except they're all the same connector on a TRS-80, so power is the same as monitor, and you got to make sure not to screw them up. But beyond that, it was pretty simple. So I was playing with it for the rest of the day because I was just fascinated with it. And I eventually wound up riding my bike down there. We had Thursday night late shopping in my small city I grew up in. So I'd ride my bike down there and hack away for 3 or 4 hours and spent a lot of time there. And then eventually I rode my bike down to the University of Regina Computer Lab where they had a PDP-11 and I had an account that I could get in and code in BASIC and so on and so forth. So those are my two really initial experiences with computers. And I remember thinking that what we have now with ChatGPT-4 is kind of what I was expecting from the computer because, you know, I'd seen Star Trek and whatnot. So I would type in my programs effectively in English and it would say SN error, which I thought was spelling error, which is, of course, syntax error. But so pretty naive experience just going in totally blind. But
yeah, it must have seemed magical, though, you know, just using a computer, you know, back in those days.
Yeah, I've kind of looked back at it and I get a massive dopamine rush from making a computer do anything, especially if it's something complicated or hard that I made it do. And I really enjoy that process and I did from the first day.
Well, let's talk about your first home system then. What was your first computer you got and how did you get it?
My parents, when I was about 15, saved up and they managed to get a Commodore 64 and a 1541 drive. And I had a little 13-inch Zenith TV in my bedroom, so I used that as the monitor. And that was really the first computer we ever owned. And in fact, it's the last thing anybody ever bought for me because I used that to write code that I bought an Amiga with, and it just kind of cascaded forward. So,
Yeah, you were lucky to have the 1541 floppy drive. I had my first machine, a Commodore Plus 4 that I still got next to me. It was all cassette based over here, though. Yeah, floppy disk drives were way too expensive in the UK. So, yeah, the amount of time I spent ages waiting for games to load from cassette tape. So, having a floppy drive was definitely something nice to have back then, I imagine.
yeah, although they were so unreliable because the early ones overheated so badly that it spent many, many months of its first year in the shop. So I spent a lot of time with the cassette deck as well.
So how did you learn to program the Commodore 64? Because I know the Commodore 64 is basic. It wasn't the most fully featured. I remember a lot of, you know, peeking and poking was the order of the day on the Commodore 64. How did you start programming that machine then? And was it basic all the way or did you get into assembly and machine code as well?
Almost simultaneous. So I think I had the programmer's reference guide, the classic spiral bound one. And so it had a pretty good set of documents for BASIC itself, and I was able to use that to learn BASIC. And the back of the book was all this assembly language, and I didn't have an assembler, but I had a machine language monitor on cassette, so I would load that up and tinker in machine language or assembly language. Well, it's hex, so it depends what you're looking at. But I was always blown away by, you could do things like increment the screen color in a loop, and it would only make it about 20 pixels before the color changed, you know, as opposed to BASIC flashing the entire screen at a slow frame rate. And or if you animated a sprite, it was infinitely fast effectively. And so I was always blown away by how much faster assembly and machine language was. So I kind of gravitated to it from the beginning.
What kind of things were you writing at first on the Commodore 64 then? Were you doing applications or games? What kind of stuff were you making?
I was doing games. The very first thing I wrote was basically a Galaga clone, except it only had the mothership because I couldn't do all these sprites. There aren't that many sprites when you're just not multiplexing them. And I remember it was a horrible code, the ultimate in spaghetti code, because not having an assembler, I wrote it in the monitor, but you could not insert code. So if you wanted to insert code, you had to jump out to some spare space and then write your code there and then jump back to where you had been. So it was completely horrible and unmaintainable. But it was my first experience with it. And when I finally finished it, I went to format a new floppy in order to copy all my code over to it. And I got it backwards and I wound up formatting my original. So it's lost to the ages now, but I'm still bitter about it too, as you can tell. So
Well, you mentioned about getting an Amiga as well, and I'm a massive fan of the Amiga. Behind me in this room, I've got an Amiga 4000 set up. That is probably my favorite of all my retro machines. So, tell us about getting your Amiga then, and why did you want that machine?
well, basically what was going on was I had dropped out of high school and I wasn't doing much, and I was working at a paint store or something like that. And a guy that I'd gone to high school with called me from Ottawa and said, "Hey, do you still know how to program?" I was like, "Yeah, it's been a year or two, but I think I do." And he said, "Well, we're looking for game programmers," and they were contracting with Gremlin and Accolade and a couple other companies like that. So it was a small design house in Ottawa. And he said, "Well, here's what we're doing. We're doing a cycling game, and it's got to have 3D parallax scrolling, and it's got to have the sprites multiplexed. Write a really quick demo, send that to us." And everything was done by VHS through FedEx at that point because you couldn't send anything online yet, of course. So I wrote the code to do that demo, and I had watched a friend named Chris. Uh, the summer before, we had worked on a game called Commander Video. He did all the code, and I did all the graphics. But I spent a lot of time watching over his shoulder and kind of learning assembly language more and seeing how he did the raster interrupts and that kind of thing. So I learned a great deal from him and used most of that to write that demo. So they wound up hiring me, and I got in my car and I drove whatever it was 5 days east to get to Ottawa. And they set me up with just a Commodore 64 and then a SFD 1001, the IEEE drive, which was quite a bit faster than the 1541. But after a while, one of Chris's friends, I think Kevin Packel, had written something called TSDS, which basically allowed you to do all your assembly and editing on the Amiga. And then there was a cable ran to the 64, and it acted as a virtual floppy drive for the 64. So you could write and do everything on the Amiga and then just type load and run on the 64. And it was an order of magnitude faster at assembling code. So I decided to get an Amiga at that point just so I could do that. Then we had to own our own. It's not like it was a company piece of hardware, so it was my own Amiga and everything. But that's where I first got the Amiga.
Was that the 500 or the 1000? Which model did you get?
It was the 500. It was just when the 500 first came out.
Yeah, really nice machine. And obviously, you released software for the Amiga as well, and it had a great operating system. What do you think made the Amiga so special then? 'Cause it must have felt like a big generational jump from the Commodore 64.
It really did, especially going from assembly language to C. C was pretty mysterious, especially on the Amiga where it's really verbose, struct intuition based pointer equals struct intuition based load library. It's just a massive line of code to load a library. And you look at that and as the first intro hello world, and you're like, oh my goodness, this is way different than what I'm used to. So I got a book called Born to Code in C, I think. I forget who wrote it, but he's still out there somewhere. And started with that and then learned C enough to be able to make my way around on the Amiga. But my day job was still writing 6502 for the 64. So it was, basically tinkering. And eventually I think I got a copy of the Lattice compiler saved up, and I got the big 3-volume set. I still got it here somewhere, actually. And from there, I never really looked back once I had a good compiler. So
Well, your big Amiga product was Hypercache, and I've seen it described as the first commercial disk caching software. So, how did you come up with that idea? And explain a bit how Hypercache worked.
I would imagine there was solutions on the PC before that. It probably was the first Amiga accelerator or disk cache, I would think, because the factory operating system didn't have it, except you could type add buffers, I think, in your boot config and add some read caching for the floppy drives, but there was no support for hard drives. And I looked around and I found a piece of code that was doing something with the device driver, but I saw that it got far enough that it actually loaded, found the device driver, and was looking at the jump table at the beginning. And that's where you can find read and seek and write and all the very basic IO commands. So I decided, well, what if I intercepted read? And from that, I started building a cache, and it grew into an n-way associative read write back cache. I kind of did it as more of an experiment to see what I could do, so much more than a commercial product. But then when I was done with it, I realized it makes a huge difference in the performance of the Amiga. So I was going to sell it as shareware, but then I decided, no, I'm going to make the manuals and I'm going to shrink wrap it and do the whole deal. And I sold it through Safe Harbor and some of the other bigger catalogs in the back of Amiga magazines with they have software listings, those people. And it did fairly well for an Amiga product. And that's what put me through college, really.
And was that the first commercial product that you released?
It was actually, yeah.
Yeah, it must have been great seeing the actual finished product, in on discs and in a box and with manuals. You must have got quite a buzz out of seeing that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was going into the one computer store in my hometown and seeing it on the shelf and knowing that I wrote it. That had a cool feeling to it. So
What about working with the Amiga, though, in terms of, because the operating system was very advanced for the time, I think it was the first home computer that had proper multitasking. How did you find working with its operating system?
I enjoyed it a lot. I had a fair bit of experience on Unix, and not that the Amiga is similar to Unix, but at least it's a preemptive multitasking. There's no memory protection in the earlier models, which is kind of a drawback. But compared to, I don't know if they're real time, but the simpler operating systems like MS DOS and CPM, it was just light years ahead of that. So I really enjoyed working on it. Although until I got the RKMs, which I forget what that stands for, maybe that's German or something, but the manuals for the actual operating system code, it's pretty opaque. But once you get that, then it's fun to work with.
Yeah, you're right about lack of memory protection as well. I remember that Guru meditation era was a very familiar sight in the early days of the Amiga.
Yeah, we just been working on a project called Night Driver for the last year or two, and his Fatal Error exception is a ASCII art version of the Guru meditation error. So
Well, let's talk about your time at Microsoft then. So, I mean, you started working for them in the early 1990s. How did your journey lead you to Microsoft, and why did you want to work there?
well, after I'd worked in the game industry for a little while, I realized I probably needed a degree at some point. So I decided to go back, and I finished high school when I was 21, and then I went on to university. And in my last year of university, I was looking for an internship, or in my second last year, I was on an internship, and I was in the food court with the old and the bored, and I was just reading a book I'd grabbed at Kohl's bookstore, and it was Hard Drive, Microsoft and the Making of Bill Gates, or vice versa. And I read the book, and I was just fascinated by the people and the projects and the way they did things, and I just felt such a kinship with that whole process. It was like I need to be there, but I was in Saskatchewan, I had no idea how. So what I did is I went back, and Hypercache had these blue registration cards, and you had to fill out your name. And then back in the day, this is how you registered your software for updates and so on. And so I went through the stack because I'd actually asked for email, which was kind of innovative at the time. And so not many had email, so it was pretty easy to check. But I looked for anybody with a Microsoft.com email address and then cold emailed them saying, "Hi, I'm a student in Saskatchewan looking for a job," basically. And one fellow named Alistair Banks wrote back to me, and he connected me with a couple internal people there, hiring managers. And so I wrote directly to them, and they did a phone screen, and then they brought me out for a series of interviews, and I got a summer internship out of that. And so that's when I went to MS DOS.
Well, do you remember much about that interview process? What it was like?
I do. It was really grueling. They don't do this anymore. It's a much kinder, gentler world, I guess. But it was basically 5 1-hour interviews with a lunch interview in between. And well, if you made all 5, because the fifth was the as appropriate, basically, if you were doing well in the first 3 or 4, then they would put you on to the hiring manager who made the business decision to hire you or not. Um, and each one was programming tasks like find the number of bits set in a byte or reverse this linked list, those kinds of programming problems. And some were brain teasers, the ones you hadn't heard because the internet wasn't really a thing yet. With the one kid got a blue hat and there's 2 red hats and they're in order. How do you figure out what hat is on what kid? Those kind of problems, or the fox and the chicken and the bag of feed across the river, I think. Those kind of problems. And it wasn't so much whether you could solve them, but it was your process of thinking it through, how you worked with them, how well you were able to think out loud and on a whiteboard articulate what it was you were doing.
It sounds a pretty intense day that must have been.
It was. And, I didn't know at the time that I had autism, but people with autism kind of struggle in that structure. I think it's a lot. It's a lot of social interaction. It's a lot of being present and putting on your mask. And uh, by the time 5 hours are up, it's a lot.
Yeah, ready for a sleep after that, I imagine.
Yeah, they're ready for something.
Well, when you did get the job at Microsoft, then what were you initially working on there?
I started on MS-DOS 6.2, and they put me on, I think, initially Smart Drive, which is because I had written this cache, which is kind of how I'd gotten the job at Microsoft. They stuck me on the cache for Smart Drive, and I added the ability to cache CD-ROMs because the MSCDX drivers were just coming out, and they were also totally uncached. So I did all the caching for devices. And I think it's a long time ago. I think that's when we added write back caching to the hard drive caching as well. And then I did a bunch of work to move as much as I could of the code and data up into the high memory area on the PC, which is that first bank of memory that's addressable by 16 bits by wrapping the pointer around. So you can still use it on a 640K machine, but it moves everything out of the 640K base if it's there. So I did the conversion for double space as well. And I think I wrote single pass disk copy so that you could do a disk copy without swapping disk 8 times or whatever it was. Then I did the setup program, wherein if you had a previous version of MS-DOS, you could use a single floppy, and I used deltas on the binaries to just patch and upgrade so you could go from 6 to 6.2 with a single disk.
Right.
Saved them a fair bit of money, I imagine.
Yeah, I bet. And I mean, that time at Microsoft as well, that must have been quite an exciting time in the, early as we get into the mid 1990s, because that was, the lead up to the release of Windows 95, which, do you have much memories of that time then? Because I imagine there was a lot riding on the release of Windows 95. It was such a big product for Microsoft.
I do, but my timeline was I was in MS-DOS until MS-DOS was done, and then I moved to Windows NT to work on Common OLE. And Common OLE delivered into Windows 95 because it shipped for Office and everything else, which means my code is in Win 95, but I was actually on the NT team when it shipped, and we weren't competitors, but there's always a certain amount of rivalry in between teams and groups. So I was a thorough NT guy, and we didn't get invites to Win 95 launch. I mean, I went over there to check it out and see what was going on anyway, but we didn't get the colored T-shirts and the official invite anyway.
Oh, wow. So you did actually go to the launch yourself, though? Because, I mean, I've seen YouTube videos of the Windows 95 launch, and it looked like, I've never seen a software launch like that before. It looked like a rock concert. I mean, what memories have you got of that then? It must have seemed very glamorous for a software launch back then.
It did. I think my most vivid memory is the fact they painted all the grass green for acres and acres. Because there's a huge open common area at Microsoft there, and they wanted it to look good. So they literally paint the grass green so it looks like turf. And then the huge white tents were erected, and Jay Leno's wandering around. And I don't remember the actual launch, so I don't know that I stuck around that long. I was there more for the pre-events and then headed back. But so yeah, I do remember the day pretty well, though.
Well, let's talk about something that, is still used by millions of Windows users all around the world that you were behind. That is, of course, the Windows Task Manager. So tell us a bit about what inspired its creation and tell us a bit about the development of that.
I think I was used to some of the process reporting stuff on the Amiga, and on NT, your end task dialog was basically a list of windows, and it was really, really basic. So I'd always worked on stuff on the side. I had done all the Hypercache stuff, and I had continued writing shareware on the side when I was at Microsoft. And so I started tinkering with Task Manager. And the problem I ran into initially was that the way for getting reporting on processes and all that was done through the registry, HKey performance data or something like that. And it was really slow and incomplete. So I thought, well, I'll take it in and I'll just continue writing it as an internal product because then I can use all the APIs that I need to use, which I can't do in a shareware product because I don't know them technically, right? You're stuck with the public linker files at least. So I continued developing it, and a couple people saw it and were curious about it, and I let them take it and try it, and it kind of spread around the team, and I forget how it became a decision, but at some point it was just in the product. So
You must have been very pleased that that was baked into the main operating system release thing. So obviously it's such a valuable part of Windows.
yeah, more so now because when I was I got the code for Task Manager XP to do an episode on the channel. And when I was talking to Microsoft about getting the code and so forth, I was talking about metrics with them. And apparently there's well over 1 billion installed users, and there's something like 2 billion invocations every month. So it's pretty well used.
Well, something else that was very well used back in the day, I wonder how much productivity time in offices was lost due to this back in the day. That brilliant game, Space Cadet Pinball, or 3D Pinball for Windows, as it was known as well. That was a game that was a favorite for an entire generation. All my friends at school and college were playing that for years. So tell us a story about that's creation then. I mean, was it exciting to be able to work on a game, while you're at Microsoft?
It was. That came about because the vice president at the time, Jim Alchin, he wanted people to see NT as cool and capable and potentially that it could run games if it came down to it and that kind of thing. Whereas it had a very staid server image. And so he wanted something cool. And I don't know whose idea it was, but they said, well, let's take the Win95 pinball game, which already existed from Maxis as a company. It came with 3 tables, I think. And we got that code, and my problem was, of course, I'm on NT now. So not only am I fully 32-bit, I also have MIPS, Alpha, PowerPC, and Forerunner of IA64. And I've got to make it work on all of these platforms. And the thing is not written to work on any of these platforms. It's very much on almost an MS-DOS style of gaming coding approach, but very 16-bit, very packed, and just stuff generally that will not work on a 64-bit or 32-bit RISC platform. So it was kind of a rewrite. And what I did was run the original game as kind of an engine inside of a box, and then I interfaced with it because some of the code was so hard to deduce what it was doing. There were state machines built with huge switch tables that you would have to map out to find out what was going on. And that's actually how we left the Easter egg in for the very first release. It was either we didn't know it was there, or we couldn't figure out how to remove it easily without breaking it.
Remind us what that was. What was Easter egg again on the...
Easter egg may be the wrong term, but if you type in a certain combination of letters, then you are able to drag and click the ball and just bang it into what you want. You get an infinite number of balls. You can advance the score. It's basically the test mode built into the game was left in.
Right. Yeah, and obviously, I mean, that was a part of, the Windows Plus pack. I remember that came out, and then, Windows XP had a version of it as well. I mean, was your NT, the version of it, the basis for the Windows XP release?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the code that everybody knows is the one that I ported, unless you happen to have the Plus pack, I guess. I was in the Plus pack as well with ZipFolders. That was another piece of code that I wrote, which was called Visual Zip at the time, but
very useful as well. You couldn't imagine not having that built into an operating system today, could you?
No, and it was interesting because I had released it as shareware, and I was selling 10 or 15 copies a day, something like that, through the mail. And I got a call, and I had permission, of course, to do this for Microsoft or to work on side projects. And I got a call from the Microsoft person over in legal, or not legal, I guess it was in product development. And they said, "Are you the author of ZipFolders?" I'm like, "Yes." And they said, "Okay, well, we want to talk about an acquisition, long story short, of the software." And I said, "Oh, what building are you in?" And she said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I'll stop by." And she says, No. You got to talk to legal, and you got to talk to travel, and we got to figure out the logistics." And I'm like, "Why would I do that when I'm in building 8? And they had no idea that I worked at Microsoft. So
yeah, even all that, working for a big corporation, I imagine there's a lot of that red tape that is required for any project to get greenlit.
I imagine they probably had the go ahead to get a zip. I mean, the version that I understood was that they were going to get a zip program from somebody no matter what. And I basically had 2 options, which was I could give them mine at whatever price they stated, or they could buy it at another one. And then I would be in competition with Microsoft and can't do that. So then I would have to quit or stop the software. So you don't get not a lot of negotiating room there. But
yeah, it's funny because I set up a Windows 95 machine recently. And yeah, that was one thing I completely forgotten that wasn't in the operating system. I was like, how do I need to download WinZip, completely forgotten about that before it was built in. So yeah, different time.
I'm one of the few people I think that has registered copies of WinZip and WinRAR, because when I was developing mine, of course, I needed to own their software in order to make sure it was compatible and whatnot. And so I've still got my old WinRAR registration from the very early 90s.
You're that one guy that registered it. Well, I mean, obviously, if we're talking about Microsoft back then, I mean, Bill Gates, did you get to work with Bill then, and any memories of Bill that stand out for you?
No, not directly. I was a couple levels down from Bill. I think it was a very shallow organization at that time. I think I was 4 or 5 people removed in the tree, whereas now you would be probably 30 people removed from Satya, I would imagine, but much bigger company too. But I didn't have occasion to work with him much. I mean, I saw him in the halls and the occasional time. And I remember coming up to a crosswalk, and there was a pedestrian in the crosswalk, and I kind of stopped short, and I looked up, and it's Bill. But fortunately, that wasn't career limiting.
Well, around that time, I mean, we're talking about the run up to Windows XP now, and Windows 2000 was released. It's still my favorite version of Windows of all time, Windows 2000s. And then when XP was launched, basically the home and the NT kernels were merged, weren't they? And it became a product that was based on NT then. And one of your claims to fame, and I've seen your great YouTube video about this, but maybe you can just kind of summarize it for people that haven't watched that video yet, is you managed to sneak Microsoft Bob into Windows XP. So what happened there?
Well, as much as I'd like to say, I can neither confirm nor deny the presence of Microsoft Bob in Windows XP. The reality is, I was doing product activation for XP. It was one of the last things I worked on. And there was the problem of how do we ship a set of keys that are tied to the BIOS of the machine in a way that people can't easily duplicate and just post to Usenet at the time, because alt binaries was kind of or alt wares, those things were the main distribution mechanism. And so I decided, well, if we've got slack space on the CD, I'm going to make a large file, which in that day was 10 megabytes. And I'm going to digitally encrypt it and use it as a massive key that you have to have along with the CD key in order to activate the product. So if you're going to download a crack, it's going to have at least 10 megabytes of completely random data that doesn't compress. And I looked around for things I could use, and I thought, well, I could just call CryptGenRand and generate a whole bunch of data, but that's no fun. So I went up on the product servers and I grabbed the disk images from Microsoft Bob. Then I encrypted them with the WinZip encryption, and then ultimately with PGP and one other mechanism, and with keys that I honestly can't remember today. So there's no chance of it coming back until they break that encryption, I imagine. But so this ballast of a large file that was tied to your CD key is actually the image of Microsoft Bob.
That's hilarious. So that must have meant, Microsoft Bob then must have been a lot more widespread than anyone realized back then.
Yeah, by far, probably shipped 1,000 to 1 in terms of distribution.
So why did you leave Microsoft in 2003 then? What happened there?
So I had always been doing software on the side, as I noted, and what happened was the software on the side started doing pretty well. I had been selling through the mail, and when the internet happened, I decided, well, I'm going to try running a banner ad and see how that works. And I went to a aggregator of advertising where you can sign up with your credit card and you say, I want this many banner ads, and you pay, and then I would have the checkout and everything all online as well. So it was the whole end-to-end process really for the first time. And I said, okay, I'll launch it for the weekend and see how it does. And I came back on Monday, I think, morning, and I checked it and I looked and I realized I had not set a cap on anything, and it had sold or it had run up a charge of $10,000 to $15,000 in banner ads. And I was kind of, I'm making $100 a day on this thing. It's take a while to pay that back. So I went to the sales report and found, oh my goodness, it made like $30,000 in sales. And I realized that with the scale of the internet at that point, all you've got to do is just roll out a lot of advertising. And if you've got a good product, then it was a 30-day trial, money back guarantee. You didn't have to activate right away. So there weren't a lot of returns because people knew what they were getting by the time they got it. And it was just a really good business to be in at the time. And it wound up paying a fair bit more than my day job. And it came down to the fact that I couldn't do both well anymore. If I was giving enough time to the side business, then I was working shorter hours at Microsoft, and vice versa. When Microsoft got busy due to product ship cycles and stuff, then my other thing suffered, and I had to make a decision, do one and do it well.
Only so many hours in the day, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned on about the rise of the internet there. One thing that just came to mind is I remember obviously the browser wars around that time. I mean, that was a big thing for Microsoft when Internet Explorer came along, and kind of the demise of Netscape as well. I mean, have you got any kind of memories of inside Microsoft at that time, kind of what that was like and how important Internet Explorer and the internet suddenly became to the company?
I was rather cynical about the internet. This before IE. This is in the very early days. I kind of thought it was CB radio, a fad, because that wasn't being used for anything useful yet. I was used to Gopher and Telnet and the various Unix type utilities for the internet, but the web I wasn't impressed with. But then, of course, it became pretty obvious that it was something amazing. And in terms of the browser itself, I know the guy who owned the browser, but I never worked on the browser myself, except for it uses Common OLE and that kind of thing. But Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with the actual code base or anything of Internet Explorer, but it was, of course, a big deal to the company at the time. And I think we all probably had Navigator on our machines at some point, and then we would switch to IE and dog fooded, as they called it back then.
Hmm. Yeah, IE definitely became the superior browser, by the time it got to like release 4, I think. And I thought Netscape became quite bloated around that time when they started bundling all the composer and everything in as well. So, yeah, it was no surprise really that IE became the dominant platform, I think. But as you mentioned, the internet was just becoming such a big deal, wasn't it? That it was an easy way for people to get online if they were running Windows already.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's talk today about your YouTube channel. The fantastic Dave's Garage. So, what inspired you to pick up a camera and start recording videos?
Basically, what happened was I got diagnosed with autism, and I did not want that to be a limiting factor, that there's certain things you can't do or can't do well. And so I looked at the set of things that I was probably most challenged at and decided, well, I'm going to go do those things because, the most discovery happens in uncharted waters, I guess. So I went out and I had a big open house shop party here at my shop for 100 people. And I wrote a book and I started a YouTube channel and some other things like that were just out of my comfort zone. And I'm not somebody who likes having their picture taken even. So editing myself in 4K 60 all day long is a bit of a challenge, but I'm starting to get used to it. So that was really the start of the channel. And like most channels, I've left the old videos up just for painful, painful uh, contrast. It's hard to get started with anything. The first 1,000 subscribers are, of course, very, very slow. And it's quite an uphill battle, but I was learning a lot as I went. So
Do you remember which video kind of pushed your YouTube channel in front of more people? Did you have one video that really made the channel blow up?
I think the round to get over the hump to 1,000 subscribers was Theo Joe did a video on a Reddit post of mine. He basically read the Reddit post as an episode, and it was about Task Manager and some of the trivia and history about that. And that drew a lot of people my way. And then I guess that got me enough traction that once people saw it, they started coming back.
What's your process for making videos? And do you kind of plan them meticulously and script them, or is it a bit more free flowing these days? How does it kind of work?
No, I do script. I sometimes go off script and then I have to go back and fix it for the closed captioning. But generally, I script everything in advance and I write one page per 2 minutes. I tend to talk too fast in my episodes. I realize that, but my pace is about 2 minutes per page. So if I write 10 pages, I've got 20 minutes of content and then I record it and then I spend a day editing it. So it's probably a day to write, a day to record, day to edit. It's about a half-time job, a little bit more than a half-time job.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize how long video editing takes, doesn't it? Particularly in the early days. When you pick it up and kind of learn your way around the software, it's a bit quicker, but yeah, it's still quite intensive, isn't it? The time that it takes.
Yeah, and there's a lot of side work too. Like I'm doing an episode on laser engraver, and I've got one here, and I've been working on it for about 2 weeks, trying to figure it out, get competent with it, and so on. And so there's a lot of work goes off into the background that doesn't get shown or even seen in a short episode. So
Well, I love the fact that your channel is, it's a real mixture of current technology and retro computing as well, which obviously I'm a big fan of. And you've been showing off some incredible systems, including the Kim One that was made by MOS Technologies. Later Commodore owned them. The IMSAI 8080, the War Games computer. So, what are some of your favorite memories about exploring these machines, and how have you found covering them on YouTube?
well, the Kim One is probably my favorite. I think what I found was I was on eBay and I was looking for a Kim One, and I found one in a massive stack. And so it's two Kim One chassis from MTU welded together with hand wired interconnects between the buses, and it had the Kim One, a Rev A Kim One with all ceramic chips, which was a nice deal. And it had two 16K memory boards, a hard drive controller, a video graphics terminal, serial, prom board. So it was a completely kitted out system. And I bought that and I started with what worked and what didn't work. And I got the Kim One working. It was pretty modified to be able, people had to add terminals to them back then because it was set up for like a current loop TTY. If you wanted to do RS-232 to it, you had to actually cut some traces and change some chips, or not chips, some transistors. And so I undid all those changes to make it original again. And then went through and I fixed the two memory boards and I got almost everything working. And so I was filming my episode for the big Kim One reveal. And what ultimately happened was I was doing it for the camera and not working where I could see. And I plugged the 12 volts into 5 and the 5 volts into 12. And that the Kim one was fine because it was not powered in that moment, but the rest of the hardware took quite a shock. So I went through and I had to fix the memory boards, got those working, and I got really close on the video graphics terminal. I replaced a couple of ICs on it that I tested bad, but there was this transistor network where they take a square wave and they amplify that into 12 volts for their RAM row select. And it was basically constructed in 3D space on the back of the board off the legs of the transistors poking through, and there were no traces left on the board. This board had been reworked so many times. And I tried so many times to rebuild that circuit, and I would get one bank of RAM working, or they would both be active at once, and I could not figure out for the life of me what was going on. And I eventually sent it off, and it's just been fixed finally after a couple months, and it'll be coming back. So there will be a conclusion to that episode but I want to make sure I have everything running and working properly.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been kind of one of my dream machines. I mean, they're quite hard to get this side of the pond. And the IMSAI 8080 as well. I mean, War Games is probably my favorite movie of all time. So how do you find that machine then? What do you think about the IMSAI?
I think it's really cool. I'd never had a lot of CPM experience, but it's a little more advanced in terms of the experience than, say, the Kim 1, because you can boot into some kind of useful operating system, where with the Kim 1, you got a processor and you've got a bunch of RAM. That's about all you've got. There's also the setup for the IMSAI 8080 clone is really amazing in that the guy has programmed so much stuff on the ESP32 that you can open up a shell on the desktop and browse through the drives and drag and drop software and do all kinds of things with it. It makes it really usable. He emulates not the Cromulator, some kind of old video terminal that sounds like that. He emulates that live so you can do graphics on it, and it's a really cool setup.
I think those, the late 70s machines, though, it kind of felt like everyone was just figuring out what to do and going their own way. So every machine's kind of unique, isn't it? So they're quite interesting machines to explore, I think, that late 70s period, the first generation of micros, if you like.
Yeah, I've got an Altair as well that I enjoy tinkering with because I've been able to get basic running on it and that kind of thing. So it's historically significant and nostalgic for me in that sense, even though I've never had an Altair or anything quite like that in the day. But yeah, they're fun to tinker with. I was just going to say that one of the things that really appeals to me about the Kim 1 and the IMSAI and the machines of that era, the PET, those kinds of things, is that one person could very deeply understand an entire system. Whereas right now, you don't have a chance. You can't even understand your motherboard, let alone the operating system that runs on top of it. Not in any detail at all levels, anyway.
Yeah, you're right. There's so much happening in the background that the average person doesn't know is happening on modern systems.
Right. I mean, I spent years working on Windows, and it's growing so much that I still know how the lower levels work, but all the stuff on top now is kind of a mystery to me. So,
Well, it sounds like you've been, buying quite a few retro systems and obviously showing them off on YouTube as well. How big is your computer collection these days? And have you got any favorite machines in your collection?
well, they're all favorites. That's why I keep them. But yeah, I've got a TRS-80 Model 1 Level 1 that I bought from a dentist office that had been used a few times. It was still in the original boxes. So I'm really happy to have that one because that's kind of the machine I started on. Then I've got 3 pets. I've got an amber pet, a green pet, a white pet with a chiclet keyboard, and it's in pretty minty condition. So it's a nice one to look at, but using it is quite horrible. On the amber pet, I've built a Cherry MX keyboard for it, so it's actually useful to type on. And what else have I got over there? I've got an IBM PC that I just put the Microsoft Mach 10 card in, the accelerator. And I've got an IBM PS2 from when I worked at IBM as an intern in college, assembling PS2s and stuff. What else is over there? Oh, Apple II. That's the bulk of it. Now I've got Tempest machines and stuff like that. But
Are there any dream machines that you're looking for or you'd like to add to your collection?
yeah, I'd like a PDP 1170, but I don't see that happening. So I'm building a PDP 1123 right now, and I've just got it booting up to the initial prompt. I haven't got the drive connected yet because you have to go from the weird 50 pin down to the RLL MFM cable, which I don't have the breakout for yet. But it should, in theory, boot and run BSD 211 when I'm done. And I'm excited for that because it was a real formative machine for me, the PDP 11.
And there's not many videos about it on YouTube as well. So I think the fact that you're documenting this stuff is really important.
Yeah, a good channel is Usagi Electric. He's been going through the PDP-11 process kind of side by side with me, and he's sent me some parts. It's been really helpful, and he'll go into it in probably more detail than I'll be able to do because he'll make several episodes on it, whereas I'll try to condense everything into one. But so good channel to check out anyway.
Well, I know you've done some videos on programming classic computers. I mean, would you ever, or are there any plans to release software or maybe some games for retro systems like the Amiga or even like old versions of Windows, anything like that?
I've done a bunch of code, but not so much games. For the 64, we did Pet Rock, which is a spectrum analyzer where you plug an ESP32 into the back of the 64, and has a microphone built in, and it does the audio sampling. And the 64 displays the spectrum analyzer graph of the music. And we had wound up having to get the data into the PC, into the 64 faster than was possible at 2400 baud or 1200 baud. And we wound up rewriting all the serial routines. And a fellow over in the Netherlands named Rutger did a really nice job on using the CIA chips to drive the serial IO process in a sensible manner, as opposed to kind of the polling way they did it originally. So we got really nice speeds out of that. So there was a lot of work went in there, and it's all on GitHub and it's all open source. So, just that in terms of games, I don't think I would probably write a game, because the games on the 64 and that I care about largely for nostalgia's sake. And I don't think there was anything new that I could contribute that I would feel nostalgic about, of course. So I don't think it lines up well with what I love doing, but I do like writing code for it still.
A good pinball simulator on the 64 would be good.
Yeah, well, there's always David's Midnight Magic. That's the one I go back to, which I just realized a couple of years ago is kind of a clone of Black Knight 2000, which is the only pinball machine I have. But they're the same layout, I just noticed.
Yes, I didn't play many pinball games on the 64. The Amiga I did, Pinball Dreams and Pinball Fantasies. Great game called Slam Tilt on there as well. And, it's really hard to get the physics right, I think, particularly in a lot of those early pinball games, but they really nailed it with that one.
Yeah, the Windows Space Cadet Pinball, the physics aren't probably very realistic, but they are. It's kind of like a driving game where it doesn't have to be realistic as long as it's fun. And I think that's probably true of it. So, and that was all code that was existing in terms of the gameplay logic, but they did a nice job on that.
Yeah, 100%. So, are there any projects or videos coming up on the channel that you can tell us about? Anything you're working on right now?
Yeah, right now I'm writing the it'll probably air before this does, so it's if you're looking back at this point, but it is the top 5 fastest computer languages. And I started 3. I did C sharp, C and Python, C++ and Python, and then I drag raced them. I gave them all the same prime civ algorithm. I wrote the code natively, in Python and C++ and C sharp, and then let them each calculate the primes up to 1,000,000 as many times as they could in 5 seconds, and that generates a score. And I would compare them. And spoiler alert, C++ won, Python was third, and C sharp was in the middle. But I put that up on GitHub, and the response was amazing to it, because people came in and they wrote their own solutions that were faster. They added all new kinds of languages, and pretty soon there was a dozen languages, and then there was 2 dozen languages. And I was getting overwhelmed with just the amount of source code contributions and trying to manage all that and pull requests and everything else on GitHub. So I put out requests for help, and 3 guys long-term helped out, Rolf, Rutger, and Tudor over in Europe. They took over all the source code control and code reviews and everything else. And they've really nurtured it so that I think there are now 94 different languages, well over 100, maybe 200 solutions in there. And eventually we had to just make a decision. Let's pick the ones that follow the rules and drag race them all. And the system does that every day now. So it builds every solution, it compiles them, it runs them, it tabulates the results and creates a website for that day's reports with all the scoring on it. And I'm going to take that and reveal what the 5 fastest are.
That sounds fascinating. And I love the fact as well that you've made that a bit of a community effort as well. I mean, I imagine that's probably a big part of your channel, all these people that you're working with around the world and the retro community around these classic computers as well. That must be having that collaboration must be really useful.
Yeah, it's really interesting because my channel is effectively nonprofit. I cover expenses and then I donate the rest generally. And so because I'm not doing it to chase money, I think people are more eager to help and contribute their time, because folks like Rutger seem to spend like 2 full-time jobs on it, and he's also got his own day job. So the amount of contributions I get from the community are really significant and helpful. And I think the retro community it's not close knit, but it's small enough that people kind of feel a kinship with one another.
Yeah, and I love the retro community today. I think in many ways it feels like these classic computers are more alive than they've been in decades. So, and it's thanks to channels like yours and the amazing communities that surround retro computing as well. So, Long may it continue, Dave. Thank you so much for coming on and doing some reminiscing with us, and best of luck with the channel.
Well, thanks for having me. It was great talking to you.